The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 1. Mary Lennox. Mary Lennox was a spoiled, rude, and bad-tempered child. She was never really well, and she was thin, miserable, and sour-faced. No one liked her at all. None of this was really Mary's own fault. She was born in India, where her father worked. He was always busy with his work and paid no attention to his daughter. Her mother was pretty and cared only for parties and pleasure. She left Mary in the care of an Indian nursemaid who gave the little girl everything she wanted so that she would not cry and upset her mother. So, not surprisingly, Mary grew up into a spoiled and most unpleasant girl. One hot morning, when Mary was 9 years old, she had a strange feeling that something was wrong. From her room, she heard shouts and cries and the patter of hurrying feet, but no one came to her. She lay back down on her bed and fell asleep. When she awoke, the house was silent. Still, no one came to her, and she was angry that she had been forgotten. Suddenly, the door opened, and two Englishmen came in. "Why was I forgotten?" Mary asked, stamping her foot. "Why does nobody come?" "Poor little kid," said one of the men. "There's nobody left to come." That was how Mary learned that her father and mother had been killed by a disease sweeping in the country. The servants had died too. Mary was alone. There was no one in India to look after her. So she was sent all the way to England to live with her uncle, Mr. Craven, at Misselthwaite Manor in Yorkshire. In London, Mary was met by Miss Medlock, her uncle's housekeeper. Mary disliked her at once, but then Mary disliked everyone. Miss Medlock thought Mary was a plain, rude child, and she was quite right. As they traveled north, she told Mary about the house. It sounded very grand and gloomy, and stood on the edge of a moor. "There'll be nothing for you to do, and your uncle won't bother with you," said Miss Medlock. "He's got a crooked back. He was a sour young man until he married. His wife was very pretty, and he worshipped her. When she died, it made him more strange than ever. He's away most of the time, so you'll have to look after yourself." It was dark when they got out of the train. A carriage took them to the house, but Mary could see nothing outside in the rainy blackness. "What's the moor like?" she asked. "It's just miles and miles of wild land," replied Miss Medlock. "Nothing grows there but gorse and heather, and nothing lives on it but wild ponies and sheep." At last, the carriage stopped in a courtyard. A butler opened a huge oak door. "You are to take her to her room," he said to Miss Medlock. "The master is going to London tomorrow, and he doesn't want to see her." Mary followed Miss Medlock upstairs and through many corridors to a room with a burning fire and supper on the table. "This is where you live," Miss Medlock told Mary. "Just see you stay here and don't go poking round the rest of the house." This was Mary's welcome to Misselthwaite Manor. It made her feel cross and unwanted and lonely. Chapter 2. The Gardens. The next morning, Mary awakened to find a housemaid lighting her fire. She was called Martha, and she chatted as she worked. Mary was not used to friendly servants in India. She had never said please or thank you, and once she had slapped her nurse's face when she was angry. Somehow she knew that she must not treat Martha this way. At first, Mary had no interest in Martha's chatter, but little by little she began to listen to the friendly Yorkshire voice. Ugh, you should see all my brothers and sisters in our little cottage on the moor, Martha said. There's 12 of us, and my father only gets 16 shillings a week. My mother has a job to feed them all for that. The fresh air on the moor makes them strong and healthy. Our Dickon, he's 12. He's always out on the moor. He's good with animals. He's tamed a wild pony. When Martha left, Mary went out to play. Go and look at the gardens, Martha had said. There's not much growing now, but it's lovely in summer. She had stopped for a second and then said softly, One garden has been shut up for 10 years, ever since Miss Craven died. Mr. Craven locked the door and buried the key. He hates that garden. The grounds of Misselthwaite Manor were huge. They were divided by high walls, so there were many gardens. In some, there were flowers and trees and fountains. Vegetables grew in others. Doors led from one garden to the next, and every garden looked bare and wintry. Presently, an old man came through one of the doors. He had a surly old face and did not seem at all pleased to see Mary. Can I go through that door? Asked Mary. If that likes, he replied. There's nothing to see. Mary was hoping to find the door to the locked garden. She tried many doors, but they all opened easily. There was one wall covered with ivy that seemed to have no door at all. She could see trees behind the wall. A robin on a high branch burst into a song. She stopped to listen, and the cheerful notes brought a little smile to her unhappy face. She wandered back to the old man, who ignored her and went on digging. At last she said, There's a garden over there without a door. What garden? He asked gruffly. On the other side of that wall, she replied. I heard a robin in the trees there. The old man stood up and a smile spread across his face. Mary saw how much nicer he looked when he smiled. He whistled very softly. The robin landed by the man's foot. Here he is, he said quietly. He always comes when I whistle. Isn't he a grand little chap? Look, he knows we are talking about him. The robin, plump and scarlet-breasted, hopped about, pecking at the earth. Ben Weatherstaff, the gardener, went on digging. He's the only friend I've got, he said. When he's not with me, I am lonely. I'm lonely too, said Mary. I've never had any friends. Ben stopped and looked at her. I recognize we are a good bit alike, he said. We are not good looking and we are as sour as we look. Mary had never thought before about her sour face or bad temper. Now that she did, it made her feel uncomfortable. Just then, the robin flew up into a tree and sang with all his voice. He's taken a fancy to that, said Ben. He wants to be your friend. Mary looked up at the robin. Would you be my friend? She asked. She spoke softly and kindly, instead of in her usual hard little voice. Why? Said Ben gently. That said that like a real child instead of a sharp old woman. It was nearly like Dickon when he talks to the wild things on the moor. The robin flew over the wall. There must be a door to that garden, Mary said with determination. Well, there's none to be found now, snapped Ben. Don't go poking your nose in places where you don't belong. And he walked off without saying goodbye. Chapter 3. Robin Shows the Way. Mary spent most days out of doors. The cold wind brought a pink glow to her cheeks, and each evening she ate a good meal. After supper, she liked to sit by the fire and talk to Martha. Why does Mr. Craven hate the locked garden? Mary asked one evening. It was Miss Craven's garden. She loved it, Martha said. She was sitting on the branch of a tree when it broke and she fell. She was hurt so bad. She died. That's why he hates it. He won't let anyone talk about it. Mary had never felt sorry for anyone before, but now she understood how very unhappy Mr. Craven must be. The wind blew across the moor and moaned and roared around the house. Martha called it withering. Mary listened, and through the withering, she thought she heard a child crying. No, Martha said when Mary asked. It's only the wind or the scullery maid. She's been crying all day toothache, and she quickly left the room. Next day, the rain poured down. On a day like this at home, we all tried to keep busy indoors, except Deacon. He goes out in all weathers. He brought home a fox cub that he found half drowned. He's got a crow too, called Suit. Left on her own, Mary decided to explore the house. She went down corridors and up and down stairs. In the stillness, she heard again the faint sound of a child crying. As she stopped to listen at a door, another door opened and out came Miss Medlock. What are you doing here? She demanded. Get back to your room at once. Mary was angry. She knew that she had heard the cry, and she meant to find out what it was. The storm passed. Wait until the sun shines on the golden gorse and the heather, said Martha. I'd like to see your cottage on the moor and meet your mother, said Mary. That would love my mother, Martha said. She's kind and loving and hard-working. When it's my day out and I can go home to see her, I just jump for joy. I'd like to see Deacon too, said Mary. Yes, you'd like him, Martha said. Everyone likes Deacon. No one likes me, said Mary sadly. Well, maybe that's because you don't like other people, said Martha smiling. I never thought of that, said Mary. Mary found Ben in the garden. Spring's coming, he said. The plants are working under the soil. You'll soon see crocuses and daffy brown lilies. The robin flew over, and Mary followed him to his perch on the ivy-covered wall. He hopped down onto the soil, and as Mary came nearer, he pecked at the earth for a worm. Suddenly in the soil, Mary saw a rusty key. Perhaps it's the key to the secret garden, she thought, slipping it into her pocket. After supper, Martha told Mary about her day at home. Mother has sent you a present to cheer you up. She brought out a skipping rope with striped handles and showed Mary how to skip. "Your mother is very kind," said Mary, wondering how Martha's mother could have spared the money to buy her a rope. Now, wherever she went, Mary skipped, and the more she skipped, the stronger she gripped. Chapter 4. Dickon. One morning, Mary was watching the robin on his perch on the wall, when suddenly something happened that felt like magic. A gust of wind blew the ivy on the wall, and under the leaves Mary saw a door. She felt for the key in her pocket and tried it in the lock. It was very stiff, but she could just turn it in. The next second, she was in the secret garden. Mary's heart thumped as she looked round. It was overgrown and untidy, but she thought it was the loveliest place. She saw green shoots of bulbs pushing up through the soil, and she pulled the weeds away to make room for the crocus and snowdrops. Time slipped by as she went on weeding and clearing dead leaves and grass. At supper, she longed to share her secret with Martha, but she dared not in case she should be forbidden to go again to a secret garden. Instead, she said, "I wish I had a bit of a garden to grow things in." "That's a lovely idea," said Martha. "I'll get Dickon to bring some garden tools and seeds to plant." Mary worked with her hands in her secret garden every day. She was careful that Ben Weatherstaff never saw where she went. One day, Ben said to her, "This fresh air is doing the good. That's fatter and not so yellow." That looked like a young plucked crow when that first came. Mary laughed. She even liked Ben on his grumpy days. One day, Mary saw a boy sitting under a tree. Two rabbits and a pheasant were near him, and a squirrel clung to the tree above his head. They all seemed to be listening to the tune he was playing on a pipe. The boy got up slowly, so as not to frighten the animals. His blue eyes smiled from his round, rosy face. "I'm Dickon," he said to Mary. "I brought that garden tools and some flower seeds." His smile was so gentle and kind that Mary forgot to be shy. She felt that if animals trusted him, she could trust him too. After a while, she asked, "Do you know about the secret garden?" "I've heard of it," he said, "but I don't know where it is." Making sure no one was watching, Mary led him through the door in the wall. Dickon was amazed. He looked around at all the plants and trees. "All this will grow," he said. "There'll be flowers and roses everywhere in a few weeks." They worked together, weeding and pruning. Mary felt in a warm Yorkshire voice like Dickon's and Martha's. She asked, "Does that like me?" He laughed. "That I does, and so does the robin." After dinner, Miss Medlock came to take Mary to see Mr. Craven. "He's going away tomorrow, and he wants to see you first," she said. Mary felt a little afraid and very awkward and stiff. But Mr. Craven wasn't a bit frightening. No, he was, but really cruel. His face was handsome, but looked full of worry and mystery. He asked if there was anything she would like. Mary asked for a piece of garden to grow her own flowers. "Of course," said her uncle. "Take any bit that's not being used." Mary knew which bit this would be. She could call the secret garden her own. Chapter 5. Colin. In the night, Mary was awakened by heavy rain and wuthering of the wind. She couldn't sleep, and as she lay tossing in bed, she heard the crying again. "That's never the wind," she whispered. "I don't care what Miss Medlock says. I'm going to find out what that noise is." Candlestick in hand, she walked softly along the corridors. She saw a light shining under a door. She pushed the door open there. Lying on a four-poster bed, she saw a boy crying pitifully. He turned suddenly and stopped crying. "Are you a ghost?" he asked, frightened. "No, I am Mary Lennox," she answered. "Who are you?" "I am Mr. Craven's son, Colin," said the boy. "So I must be your cousin," said Mary. "Did no one tell you I'd come to live here?" "No, no one would dare," replied Colin. "I should have been afraid you'd see me. My father won't let people see. He's afraid I'll grow up to be a hunchback. I am always ill, so I stay here in bed. My father hates me because my mother died when I was born." "Have you always been here?" asked Mary. "Nearly always. If I go out, people stare at me and I can't stand it." "If you don't like people to see you," Mary said, "shall I go away?" "Oh no," Colin answered quickly. "Stay and talk to me." Mary sat on a cushioned stool next to the bed, and they talked for a long time. Colin wanted to know all about Mary, and she answered all his questions. He told her how miserable and lonely he felt, even though he was given whatever he asked for. "All the servants have to please me," Colin said. "It makes me ill to be angry, so everyone has to do as I say." "Do you think you will get well?" Mary asked. "I don't suppose I shall," Colin replied. "I think I'm going to die. But let's talk about something else. How old are you?" "I'm 10, same as you." Mary says. "How do you know I'm 10? He asked. "Because the garden was locked 10 years ago when you were born," Mary answered. "What garden?" Colin asked, surprised. "Just the garden Mr. Craven hates," Mary replied. "He locked the door and buried the key." "What's the garden like?" Colin persisted. "No one has been allowed to see it for 10 years," Mary answered. She was careful not to let him know that she had already found it. Colin wanted to know all he could about the garden, and they talked about the exciting things they might find there. "I shall make them open the door," Colin said. "Oh no!" cried Mary. "Let's keep it a secret." "If they open the door, it will never be a secret again. Perhaps one day we may find the door. We could go inside, and no one would know about it but us." "I should like that," said Colin. "I never had a secret before." Tired from talking, he fell asleep, and Mary crept away. Chapter 6. Rainy Days. The next morning, Mary told Martha about the crying and how she had found Colin. Poor Martha was very upset. She thought she might lose her job for allowing Mary to find the young master of the house. "You need not worry," Mary told her. "Colin was pleased, and he wants to see me every day." "That must have bewitched him," Martha cried. "What's the matter with him?" Mary asked. Martha told her that since he was born, Colin had not been allowed to walk. His father thought his back was weak. A famous doctor had been to see him and had said he would get strong if less fuss was made of him. But still, he was spoiled and given his own way. "Colin thinks he will die," said Mary. "Do you think so?" "Mother says there's no reason for a child to live if we can't get out in the fresh air," Martha replied. "It's done me good to be outside," said Mary. "Do you think it would help, Colin?" I don't know, Martha said. He had a bad tantrum when he was taken into the garden. He got angry because he thought one of the gardeners was looking at him. He cried so much he was ill all night. Well, said Mary, if he ever gets angry with me, I shan't go to see him again. On her next visit to Colin, Mary told him about Dickon. He's not like anyone else, she said. He can charm the animals on the moor. When he plays the pipe, they come to listen. The moor sounds a wonderful place, said Colin, but I'll never see it. I'm going to die. How do you know? Mary asked, feeling a little cross. Colin talked about him dying as almost as though it pleased him. Everyone says I will, Colin replied. I think my father will be glad when I'm not here. I don't believe that. That famous doctor was right. They should make less fuss of you, and they should let you go out. If you could only see Dickon, you'd want to get well. And she told him all about Dickon's family, who were so well and happy, even though they were poor. It rained for a week, so Mary could not visit the garden. Instead, she spent her days with Colin. They read and talked, and for the first time, Colin started to laugh. He often spoke of the garden and what might be in it. Mary longed to share her secret with him, but felt that she could not yet trust him. Chapter 7. The Secret is Told. After the rain, Mary awoke early one morning to find the sun streaming through the blinds. When she ran down to see the secret garden, she found that Dickon was already there. I couldn't stay in bed on a morning like this, he cried. Look at the garden. The rain and the warmth had made all the new shoots push up through the earth. There were clumps of orange and purple crocuses. Mary was breathless with happiness. The robin was building a nest. We mustn't watch too close, warned Dickon. He's too busy now for visiting and gossiping. A whole week had passed since Mary had last seen Dickon. She told him about finding Colin. If we could get him out here, said Dickon, he'd forget about lumps growing on his back. We'd be just two lads and a little lass looking on at the springtime. It will do him more good than doctor's stuff. When Mary went in at the end of the day, Martha told her that Colin was angry because she had not been to see him. I won't let that boy come if you stay with him instead of me, Colin raged when Mary went to see him. You're selfish not for coming. What are you? Snapped Mary. You are the most selfish person I know. Well, I'm going to die, wailed Colin. I don't believe it, said Mary sourly. You only want people to be sorry for you, but they're not. You're too nasty. She marched to the door and called back. I was going to tell you about Dickon and his fox and crow, but I shan't now. And she shut the door firmly behind her. Later, as she thought of Colin's lonely day, her anger faded and she felt sorry for him. If he wants to see me tomorrow, she thought, I'll go and sit with him. In the night, Mary was awakened by the noises in the corridor, and she could hear sobbing and screaming. It's Colin having a tantrum, she thought. She covered her ears, but she couldn't shut out the dreadful sound. She jumped out of the bed and stamped her foot angrily. Somebody must stop him, she cried. He deserves a beating for being so selfish. He's upsetting everyone in the house. She ran into Colin's room and shouted, Stop! I hate you! You'll scream yourself to death in a minute, and I wish you would. Colin looked dreadful. His face was swollen, and he was gasping and choking. But Mary was too angry to care. "If you scream again, I shall scream louder," she stormed. "I can't stop," sobbed Colin. "I felt a lump coming on my back." "Turn over and let me look," Mary ordered. She looked carefully at the poor thin back. "There's not a lump as big as a pin," she announced. "Don't you ever talk about it again?" Colin's sobbing slowly died, and Mary sat by his bed quietly, comforting him until he fell asleep. In the morning, Mary found Deacon in the garden with his squirrels, and she told him of Colin's sobbing in the night. "Oh, we must get him out here, poor lad," said Deacon. "Eh, that we must," said Mary, using the same Yorkshire words. Deacon laughed. "That must talk a bit Yorkshire to Colin," he said. "It'll make him laugh, and mother says laughing's good for ill folk." When Mary went to see Colin, she told him about Deacon and his squirrels, Nut and Shell. They laughed and talked for a long time. Then Colin said, "I'm sorry that I said I'd send Deacon away. I didn't mean it. He sounds like a wonderful boy." "I'm glad you said that," said Mary, "because he's coming to see you, and he's bringing his animal." Colin cheered up. He looked so happy that Mary suddenly decided to take a chance. "That's not all," she said. "There's something better. I found the door to the garden." Colin was overjoyed. "Then shall we go in and find out what is inside?" he asked. Mary paused and then boldly told the truth. "I've already been in it. That's why I could tell you so much about it. I didn't dare tell you my secret until I was sure I could trust you." Chapter 8. I Shall Live Forever and Ever. At breakfast, Colin announced to his nurse, "A boy and some animals are coming to see me. Bring them straight up when they arrive." It wasn't long before Mary heard a bleating. "That's Deacon's lamb," she cried. "They're coming." Deacon came in smiling. He carried a lamb, and his little fox trotted beside him. Nut the squirrel sat on one shoulder and Shoot the crow on the other. His other squirrel shell peeped out of a pocket. Colin stared in wonder. Deacon gently put the lamb in Colin's lap and gave him a bottle to feed it. They were all so busy and happy together. "I am going to see it all," cried Colin. "Hey, that must," said Mary, "and that must not lose no time about it." Colin was put in his chair, and Deacon pushed it along the paths. As they went, Mary told Colin about the places they passed. "Here's where I met Ben," she said, "and this is where I saw Robin. And this is," she whispered, "this is the garden." Mary opened the door, and Deacon pushed the chair inside quickly. Colin looked round for a long time, seeing all the things Mary had described. Then he cried out, "I shall get well. I shall live forever and ever." That afternoon, the whole world changed for Colin. "It's been a grand day," said Deacon. "Eh, that it has," said Mary. "Just that thing," said Colin, "that it was made like this all for me." "My word," said Mary. "That's a good bit of Yorkshire." And they all joined in laughter. "I don't want this day to go," said Colin, "but I shall come back every day." "That will, and we shall soon have tree digging and walking." Suddenly, Ben Weatherstaff's face glared down at them from the top of the wall. "What are you doing in there?" he shouted at Mary. Then he saw Colin, and his mouth opened in surprise. "Do you know who I am?" Colin asked. "Eh, that I do," Ben answered. "That the poor crippled lad?" Colin sat up angrily. I'm not a cripple. I'll show you, he cried. He struggled out of the chair and with Dickon's help stood straight and tall. Look at me now, he shouted. God bless the lad, said Ben, and tears ran down his face. Colin remained standing. He suddenly felt his fear leave him. I'm not afraid anymore, he cried. It's the magic of the secret garden. It's working to make all the plants grow, and it will work for me. That evening, Colin was quiet. After a long time, he said to Mary, I am not going to be a poor thing anymore. If I believe I shall get strong and well, the magic will make it happen. Chapter 9 Magic. Next day in the garden, Colin called Mary, Deacon, and Ben to him. I am going to show you that the magic works, he said, slowly taking a few steps at a time. Colin walked right around the garden. His face was flushed with joy. This must be the biggest secret of all, he said. When I can walk and run well, I shall walk into my father's study and say, Here I am, well and strong. It was very hard to keep the secret. The magic of the secret garden was making Colin bright-eyed and rosy-cheeked. Each day, Colin and Mary did exercises to make them strong, and they both grew plumper and healthier. Mary became pretty, and Colin no longer looked like an invalid. Everyone was amazed at the change. Now, while the secret garden was working its magic, Mr. Craven was traveling in faraway places. For 10 years, he had been trying to run away from his sorrow and had refused to be comforted. Then one day, whilst walking in Austria, he sat down by a stream. Gradually, he felt his mind and body relax. The peace of the place filled him, and from that moment, he felt healthier and happier. One night, he dreamt of his wife's garden at Misselthwaite Manor. The dream was so clear that he decided to return home at once. As soon as he arrived home, he went to the garden. He walked slowly, as all his sad memories came rushing back. As he stood by the door of the secret garden, wondering how to find the key, he heard laughter coming from the other side of the wall. Suddenly, the door burst open and a boy ran out, almost into his arms. He was a tall, handsome boy, and Mr. Craven gazed at him, unable to speak. Colin stood still and recovered his breath. Then he said, Father, I'm Colin. You can't believe it, but it's true. He led his father into the garden and told him how the magic had made him everything grow and had made him strong and well. Mr. Craven had never heard such a wonderful story. He sat by Mary and Deacon and the animals and laughed as he had not done for years. He was so proud of his handsome, healthy son. Now, said Colin, it need not be a secret anymore. I shall never need my chair again. I shall walk with you, father. They stood up and walked towards the house. At Mr. Craven's side, strong and straight as any lad in Yorkshire, walked his son. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this book. Let's meet in another video with an interesting book.